welcome to Talk Wildlife, and today we're going to be talking about how farming and conservation can come together. I'm going to be talking to Lizzie Emmett from Wensum Farmers. Wensum, for those that don't know, Wensum is a river that runs through the north of Norfolk. It's actually the biggest river in Norfolk, and the valley is up towards the north of Norfolk. And the Wensum Farmers are a cluster of farmers that have come together around the Wensum Valley. But I'm sure Lizzie will be able to tell us a lot more. So Lizzie, who's the farm advisor for the group, is joining us. And hi, Lizzie, how are you?
Hello, yeah, very well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. So let's start off by just saying, okay, so Wensum Farmers, a cluster of farmers, they've all come together and they're doing great things for conservation. So first of all, how did that come about?
So the group came together originally in 2015. It was kind of inspired by a couple of landowners that wanted to come together and do more for conservation. And then it's kind of developed over the last few years. In 2018, they wanted to take it to a whole nother level and actually employ their own advisor. So I'm employed by the landowners, my contract is with them, and I'm full-time as well. So we've got 27 farmers in the group and we cover 10,000 hectares of the Wensum Valley. And the river itself is the spine of the group. So that is what binds us together.
So again, for those that don't know the Wensum is a chalk bed river, fantastically clear, brilliant for wildlife. And it's great that you've got these farmers coming together around that, and as you say, forming the spine, because it really is, you know, it's a really good place for wildlife. So let's talk about what the actual cluster group does. So you mentioned on the website that, you know, that you do a lot around habitat management. So how does habitat management and farming come together?
So yeah, so our group itself kind of splits priorities into two. So we've kind of got the water quality naturally on one side, and then we've got the biodiversity, because the Wensum's actually got a huge amount of problems with siltation, nutrient enrichment, invasive species. So that's one side, and then there's the biodiversity side. So we split that into kind of core projects, and some, like you say, are around sort of habitat management. One of them being that we really focus on hedges. Hedges have become of our utmost priority over the last few months, particularly looking at rejuvenating hedges. So, you know, there's so many hedges across our Norfolk landscape, which are sort of on either one side or the other side of the spectrum. They go from being sort of abandoned line of trees right through to the intensive over-trimmed. And what we're trying to do is trial in the group different ways of rejuvenating so that we get this much more natural cyclic management of our hedges, and by doing so we're obviously trying to promote that connectivity, and also the food and blossom provision. So that's the kind of hedges side of things, and we're doing that via trialing different types of laying, whether that be by doing it with a digger or doing it by hand, conservation laying, or coppicing right back down. So that's the hedges. Ponds are also a massive part of our project. Norfolk is very lucky in that we've got more ponds than any other county in the whole of the country. We have a lot of old marl pits back, you know, post the Second World War. The marl, the clay, was dug out as like a fertilizer. So these pits are scattered all across our sort of farmland landscape. But typically they're very overgrown. They don't have a lot of oxygen in, very dark and damp. But they have this incredible seed bed of all sorts of aquatic species, you know, going right from stoneworts to pondweeds. So we restore them. So that's by obviously letting light in, cutting down a lot of the kind of undesirable species, and digging the silt out, this kind of nutrient-rich sort of sludge that you get in the bottom, and then basically exposing all of these natural seeds. So the kind of hedges, the ponds, they all kind of come together. And then obviously there's the other side, which I guess we'll come on to in a minute, which is the turtle doves.
We will, yeah. Well, before we come on to that, so talking about rejuvenating hedgerows, I mean, you know, there's a lot of very, very good hedgerows in Norfolk, but then there's also a lot with big gaps, and there's also some that have been torn out. So how long does it take, roughly, to rejuvenate a hedge? Because obviously some of the key sort of trees and bushes that you're going to have in there are going to be things like your hawthorn and your blackthorn, Birch can even be put into hedges and oak. So how long does it take to see results when you're rejuvenating a hedge?
That's a really good question. Basically, it depends on the hedge because, as most people will appreciate, every hedge kind of, in my mind, gets treated slightly differently. So depending on the age of the hedge. So for example, at the moment, I've been doing some trials with farmers that the hedge is around about 8 years old. It's not too brittle because the actual kind of the stem itself isn't too brittle. So it's the perfect age for laying or rolling. So in terms of that, it's going to then be rolled, it's going to rejuvenate from the base, and then that's probably going to be another potentially 10 years before we have to then look at management again. But when you've got hedges, for example, that have been over-managed and we actually have to coppice right down, those can take a lot longer. And actually, we've got examples of where I describe them a bit like a lollipop. So the stem has actually become like a tree. Others have then failed in between, and then they get cut on the top, so a bit like a lollipop.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, those they need to be taken right back to basics again. So you're kind of taking the hedge back to planting phase, where you're planting the gaps up, and then you're coppicing right back down. Now that can take a lot longer because, of course, not only are you sort of planting the gaps and waiting for the new growth, you've also got to protect the new growth from deer and rabbits and hare. So that can take a lot longer. But in terms of the kind of best case scenario, you're wanting to do sort of a 10-15 year cyclic management.
So that's hedges. So you also mentioned ponds. So,
yeah.
I mean, again, going about refurbishing ponds, are you seeing that the ponds that you are actually refurbishing are seeing an increase in wildlife sort of almost immediately, or again, does that take some time?
Yeah, so it does definitely take some time. So the typical time scale that we look at, so we tend to do a lot of our restoration right at the end of summer, start of autumn. So sort of September's the perfect period. The reason being is because ponds tend to be at their kind of lowest in terms of water table. So in terms of when we go in and we actually do the digging, you can see a lot more, and you can actually see the difference in the soil when you actually dig, and you know when to stop, because that's very important. You don't want to actually dig the seed bed out itself, because that would be, that wouldn't help. So we tend to do that around about sort of August, September. By that point, the whole winter then tends to be just this kind of rush of water. Once you take down a lot of the tree species and the shrub species, you tend to get a huge amount more water because they're not sucking it out. You tend to get also like a rush of nutrients, so you can see some sort of algal blooms. But by the time you get right through to spring, that's when you tend to get your first species. You tend to get your water crowfoot tends to come through really quickly. That's one of the first colonized species. And then you get your pondweeds. And then by the time you get to August and July, that tends to be the best time to go in and spot the much more rarer stoneworts, for example, starwort, and have a little look at the closer species.
Excellent. And roughly how many ponds are we talking across the whole area?
Yeah, it's good you've made me mention figures, because I hadn't mentioned that. So we do about 20 ponds every year. So quite a lot. Now, in terms of the value of the group here, coming back to why we do this, there's a real competitiveness between farmers, which is brilliant. So obviously you get a few that say, okay, I'm gonna do 6 this year. Well, I'll easily get someone else in the group where I can give them a little bit of encouragement and say, well, have you perhaps thought about doing a pond this year? And then they're hooked, they're totally hooked. So it tends to be around 20, but this year I think we'll actually do more than 20 because there's so many people that want to get involved. And in terms of the value, I mean, it's very difficult to explain without actually being at a pond right now in the middle of the summer, because it is amazing in terms of the insect bursts coming out of ponds supports farmland bird species so much. And then, of course, we are working really towards our great crested newt and crucian carp populations as well, because we're in a very, very important area for GCNs. So ponds, I think, are amazing. There is a list as long as my arm about the value of ponds. They're amazing.
So earlier on, you mentioned turtle doves, and I know you've been working with a conservation organisation that's responsible for turtle doves, and another in dire trouble. So what has the group been doing in order to assist with the management of turtle dove numbers?
Yeah, so turtle doves, we're very, very fond of turtle doves. I mean, most people understand that, 98% declines in turtle dove populations. It's really, really serious. And obviously a lot of that is down to, lack of habitat, lack of food, predation, being shot on migration, all of those things. So we're trying to sort of focus in what we can do here. Now they've been coming over quite earlier actually than previous years. They sometimes come over sort of late April now. That was sort of unheard of a few years ago. But they come over and they're really, really tired, they're hungry. So the first sort of thing we want to do is to provide them with enough energy, enough food to really get them up to weight so that by the time they come to their breeding season that they're ready. So we're doing a huge amount of supplementary feeding. So they love particularly oil seeds, millet, linseed, sunflower hearts. So we're doing a lot of supplementary feeding, but on particular sites where we also have our camera traps so that we can monitor the numbers, monitor the health. And then, of course, we're doing the habitat side. So being granivores, they need a lot of water, obviously. So the kind of hedges and ponds come sort of hand in hand. So we've got this particular spot in our group where we've got a stronghold of 11 breeding pairs, which is amazing. And in that little area, it's about a 5-kilometre sort of circle. And within that area, every landowner is committed to turtle doves during that period when they come over. So we have a feeding site, we have appropriate scrubby hedges that are dense enough that they're flimsy nests to be protected. And we also have then ponds. And we aim for every single little site to be within 200 or 300 metres so that they really have that kind of setup. Then working sort of slightly out of the hub, there are farmers that are doing supplementary feeding, and we do, although there's not the level of colonisation as we'd hope, we do get turtle doves sort of passing through that will be able to use those feeding sites. And then, of course, we're supporting other species by feeding anyway.
Right, so you mentioned 11 breeding pairs in one particular area. What does that look like if you take that across the group? Is there more than that?
No. So what has happened is, going back a few years, turtle doves, as most people would understand, were so prevalent. They used to be almost like kind of collared doves, they'd be everywhere. And over the last few years, they've just minimized and dropped. And now really it's just a stronghold in a particular area. As for why that particular area, I think there's lots of theories, but the theory that I am most convinced on is that turtle doves have a particular bloodline where they will obviously go to a particular site and they'll come back again. And I've got farmers that have the right ponds, the right hedges, the right food, but they don't have turtle doves. This particular area we've got as a hub. For whatever reason, they have just been providing that for so many years, and the turtle doves probably have a good migration route. They probably have a good overwintering site in Gambia, Senegal, and it just so happens that they seem to survive and we're able to support them. The issue we've got is how we support them enough so that they can colonize, because of course that's the tricky one, but we're trying to really look after the ones that we've got in that hub.
That's brilliant. So that's turtle doves. I know that you also do sort of farmland bird surveys, and there's other wildlife that we need to talk about. So what differences have you seen over the period of time that you've been doing it with both birds and other wildlife?
Yeah, so I think, it all comes together, doesn't it? This habitat enhancement, the supplementary feeding, the predator control, it all sort of comes together. And we join up with the Wensum Valley Birdwatching Group. If any of those are watching, hello. And they've been brilliant. We have teamed them up with a farmer. We've got a couple that are fantastic, and they'll come out with me and we do surveys. And like you say, it's a really good time to recollect and have a look at, for example, the last few years. Have you got any species that are new, or are you missing some species that you used to have? And that enables me to advise to my farmers and give them some feedback about what we could be doing differently. And I definitely say that the things that have made a big difference is better hedges, absolutely. So that food provision, that protection, the habitat, Predator control as well. It has been, particularly where I've got shooting sites, although yes, it's controversial to have birds put down, their predator control itself does a huge amount for particular when we talk about lapwing, for example, and other sort of farmland birds. And then the supplementary food, I say, that is just so crucial. We tend to do farmland bird surveys in the summer when it's breeding season, but also in the winter, in that the depths of the winter when it's harshest. And I had quite a few, we do a competition with my farmers as well, with like a farmland bird survey, and they get a bottle of wine for the best one. And the guys that have, the best sites are the ones that are supplementary feeding. So, and they're finding different ways to feed and different mixes to feed, different sites. So yeah, food, habitat, water, predator control, it's all the key things.
So that's, all of this is brilliant for wildlife, brilliant for biodiversity. I've got to ask, what's in it for the farmers?
Yeah, good question. There's a whole host of different benefits to a farmer by being in a group. Obviously, the main one for them is that they get a full-time advisor working to their priorities. So obviously, I deal with their countryside stewardship. I'm also able to advise them on, like, for example, soil health. We do a whole host of different trials within the group. So we're looking at cover cropping. We also have our own water testing. So the thing that we are very committed to at the moment is improving our water quality. So I do in-depth water testing with every single farmer, looking at, for example, coming up the land drains, how we can encourage, a reduction in farm pollutant losses. And also there's this massive kind of collectiveness and collaboration between the farmers. There's a benefit to them socially, but also there's power in numbers. We're having an influence on legislation for water quality at the moment in DEFRA. We have opportunities working on the new environmental land management scheme. So the benefits are huge, funding, grant opportunities, advice from me, social, it's massive. But I would say that in terms of the habitat side, the thing that really drives them is that kind of striving to be better. And of course, that's when the competition comes in and sort of improves things, because they all want to be the best. They all want to have more species, and that kind of drives all of them to be better.
Right. So again, a lot of work being done. Have they had to change any of their farming practices in order to accommodate what they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they're all on a different journey. And this is the thing that I often have to kind of explain to people. We are all not perfect farmers yet. We're striving for that, but every single one is on a slightly different journey. And obviously my job is to tailor my advice to be able to get those small steps from every single type. And bearing in mind, they're all different businesses, they're all different soil types, they're all different personalities. And that's what it's about. As long as we're on that journey collectively, working towards something, that's the main thing. But yeah, we are having to look, for example, at reduced tillage, looking at particularly reducing our non-inversion tillage, looking at carbon footprint, looking at how we're using insecticides and fungicides. Can we reduce those chemicals that we're putting into the environment? Can we work on water quality by having a growing crop all the way through that growing season, so we never have bare land? Can we improve areas which we have in countryside stewardship for target species? So yeah, every single one of them, we're reviewing what we can do differently and how we can work towards that better farming system.
Okay, you've sort of touched on it there. What about the future? Is there going to be any additional farmers joining the group, or is the group of its maximum size now? What does the future look like for Wensum Farmers?
Yeah, very good question. The sort of main thing is that it's kind of up to them. So it's a farmer-led group to the core. And at the moment, they're sort of quite happy with the size that we are. We have got a slight expansion going on, particularly around the main river. We don't tend to sort of spill out too much into the outer catchment. But there is a small sort of expansion going on. But we've got a lot of work going on, clearly, and we want to make sure that we can kind of have this almost like sort of minimum standard across the whole group. So we're up to a certain level before we get too big, because really we're about sort of quality, not quantity. And there's still so much that we want to do. But looking forward, I think personally, we've got Brexit going on. We've also got a whole new different type of land management scheme coming in. There is going to be a massive push towards regenerative agriculture, which is this term, used quite often. But farmers are going to have to change. We're going to have to protect our soil more. We're going to have to protect our water more. And I think there are huge opportunities for my farmers for future funding and for their farm businesses by providing public good, by providing these ecosystem services.
So if you could leave farmers or people watching this with one message about farming and conservation and how it can work together, what would that be?
Oh, that is a good question. I'd say that the farming community generally is massively committed to working holistically with the environment, but by far the best result comes from collaboration. And in my experience, if you can develop a social capital, so that's relationships between me and my farmers and farmers first, the natural capital on top of that will be massively excelled than just a farmer working on their own.
Okay, sounds like a good message to me. Right, so thanks ever so much for your time. That was really insightful. It was to the point, and really introduced a lot of the work that's going on there, and a lot of it, really beneficial for wildlife. Because I used to work with you, I've seen firsthand what's happening with the turtle doves. I've seen your soil kits on your desk. I've seen your water kits on your desk. I've seen how excited you got about your water kits. So it's great that you've got that enthusiasm. So keep it up, because it sounds like an absolutely brilliant project. And maybe we'll talk in the future and find out what the results have been as they're happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. And for any of those that are watching that want to find out a little bit more, we are on Twitter, Wensum Farmers, and also we have a new website. So do check us out.
I'll put a link to your website under the video. All right, Lizzie. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Bye.